When did your kid get banned from Build-A-Bear? My 7-year-old daughter Sophie got permanently blacklisted from every Build-A-Bear on Earth after causing $40,000 in damages during a birthday party. The manager called me hyperventilating. Ma'am, your daughter she's unstuffed everything. She's performing surgery on a $400 collectible while singing Ring Around the Rosie. Please come immediately. I could hear chaos, the sound of industrial stuffing machines running nonstop, children shrieking, someone yelling about calling corporate. When I arrived, it looked like a teddy bear massacre. Unstuffed bearskins hung from the ceiling like pelts. Mountains of white fluff covered everything like snow. Sophie had somehow hijacked the stuffing machine and was operating it like a carnival game, shooting stuffing at anyone who tried to stop her. In the center sat Sophie, performing emergency surgery on a limited edition birthday bear with plastic scissors from the craft station, carefully removing its voice box while other kids watched in horror. Sophie, what happened? I'm liberating them, Mommy. The birthday girl's mom, Mrs. Ashford, was near tears. Your daughter ruined my Penelope's $2,500 party. She told the children their bears were slaves. Sophie, explain. The Platinum Party kids got to put heartbeats in their bears for free, $15 each. But the regular party kids were told their bears would be soulless without heartbeats. So Maya's grandma had to choose between a heartbeat or lunch for the week. The manager tried to interrupt. It's a premium add-on. Then they made the poor kids' bears work for the rich kids' bears. They had to make their new bears bow to Penelope's bear because hers had a crown. They called it Bear Kingdom Roleplay. Maya's bear had to be a servant bear. It had to carry the rich bear's accessories in its little paws. Mrs. Ashford shifted uncomfortably. It was just pretend. They made us do a fashion show where only platinum bears could walk the runway. Our bears had to sit on the floor and clap. Then they said our bears were too ugly to be in the birthday photo. They made us hide them under the table. The stuffing machine incident? When they said only platinum kids could record custom messages for their bears, $25 each. But the poor kids had to listen to their bears say the default message, I love you, in that creepy robot voice forever. I snapped. Sophie stood up, still holding the voice box. I told everyone their bears were prisoners. That Build-A-Bear was a sweatshop. That we were enslaving cotton-filled Americans. Then I started the liberation. She performed autopsies on display bears to show their organs. The manager shrieked. She convinced 12 children that the bears could feel pain. One kid tried to give his bear CPR. I unstuffed Penelope's $400 birthday bear first, Sophie continued proudly, in front of everyone. Like a French Revolution, but for teddy bears. Then I taught the other kids how to unstuff their own bears to free their souls. She started a bear uprising, Mrs. Ashford screamed. The children were chanting free the bears while destroying everything. She turned a birthday party into Animal Farm. The teenage employee spoke up. She convinced me bears have consciousness. I helped her liberate the entire Christmas collection. Sophie, did you break Penelope's arm? She tried to stop the revolution. Her arm went crack. Victory required sacrifice. Mrs. Ashford stepped forward. My husband is on the Build-A-Bear board of directors. You'll be hearing from our lawyers. Sophie looked her dead in the eyes. Then he's a war criminal in the Bear Industrial Complex. I smiled. Mrs. Ashford, does your husband still visit that special club downtown? The one with the very specific dress code? Her face went white. But that wasn't even the real reason Sophie started the bear revolution. What we found in the manager's office changed everything. I pushed past the manager's half-hearted attempt to block me and step into her office, my shoes crunching on loose stuffing that's drifted in from the main store. Mrs. Ashford's voice carries through the doorway behind me, shrill and threatening. Something about her lawyers and criminal charges and ruined reputations. The office is small and cluttered, walls covered in corporate motivational posters about exceeding sales targets and maximizing customer experiences. Layla's desk sits in the center, buried under stacks of papers and binders, and what I see there makes my stomach drop. Spreadsheets cover the surface, columns of numbers tracking party packages and revenue by tier, with headers like platinum versus standard party revenue optimization, and premium add-on conversion rates by income bracket. I lean closer, hands trembling as I pick up a printed email chain, and the subject line reads, Maximizing emotional upsell opportunities with economically vulnerable families. My vision blurs for a second as I process what I'm reading. These aren't just premium options or business decisions. This is a system designed to exploit children's feelings and parents' financial stress. A training manual sits open on the corner of the desk, its title making me feel sick. Leveraging child peer pressure for premium add-on conversion. I flip through the pages and find instructions for staff on how to emphasize the differences between party tiers, how to use language that makes standard packages feel inadequate, how to position premium add-ons as necessary for a complete experience. There are scripts teaching employees to say things like, without a heartbeat, your bear won't have a soul, and the other children's bears will be so much more special. My hands shake harder as I pull out my phone and start taking photos of everything. Layla lurches forward from where she's been standing frozen by the door, reaching for my phone with panic in her eyes. Sophie appears in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the chaos of the main store, and her voice cuts through the tension. Mommy, why does the manager lady look so scared? Layla's hand stops inches from my phone, her face pale and sweaty. I keep photographing, moving methodically through the papers, making sure I capture every damning detail. Mrs. Ashford pushes past Sophie into the small office, her expensive perfume overwhelming in the confined space, and she grabs my arm. What are you doing? You can't just take pictures of private business documents. I shake her off and keep photographing, my phone clicking rapidly as I document page after page, Mrs. Ashford leans over to see what I'm capturing, and I watch the color drain from her face as she reads the email chain on top of the pile. Her mouth opens and closes without sound. The emails are from someone named Steve Briggs, discussing the rollout of what he calls the Tiered Party Experience Pilot Program. Mrs. Ashford's breathing gets shallow and fast as she reads her husband's name attached to messages about targeting mixed-income neighborhoods and using social comparison to drive premium purchases. The teenage employee who helped Sophie with the bear liberation edges into the doorway behind Sophie, and she speaks quietly, almost a whisper. I've been really uncomfortable with this stuff for months. They train us to make kids feel bad if their parents can't afford the expensive packages. I didn't know who to tell, or if anyone would believe me. I finish photographing the last document and look up at Layla, who's backed against the wall, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Ashford is still staring at the emails, her perfectly manicured hands shaking as she holds the papers. Mrs. Ashford suddenly lunges forward and snatches my phone from my hands, her fingers fumbling with the screen as she tries to delete the photos. You can't have these. My husband will destroy you. He has lawyers, real lawyers, not whatever bargain attorney you think you can afford. Her voice cracks on the last words, the threat losing power as she speaks it. I stay calm, watching her panic and pull my backup phone from my purse. Already backed up to cloud storage. Automatic sync. You can smash that phone if you want, but the photos are safe. Her face crumples and she drops my phone onto the desk, stepping back like it burned her. She starts screaming about legal action and defamation, and how her husband's position gives them power I can't imagine. But her voice wavers and breaks, the fear bleeding through her anger. I mention the special club downtown again, keeping my voice level and quiet, and watch her face go from red to white, the one with the very specific dress code. I'm sure the board of directors would be interested in knowing where their executive spends his Thursday evenings. Mrs. Ashford's mouth snaps shut and she looks away. Layla slides down the wall until she's sitting on the floor, sobbing into her hands. Corporate made us do this. They sent the training materials and the scripts and told us our jobs depended on hitting conversion targets. I hated it. I hated watching kids cry when they couldn't get heartbeats for their bears. I hated the way the rich kids treated the poor kids during parties. But I have a mortgage and student loans and I need this job. Her voice is thick with tears and shame. Sophie walks over to Layla and looks down at her with those serious 7-year-old eyes. You could have said no. You could have told someone. You're a grown-up. Layla just cries harder. I gather Sophie's hand in mine and step toward the door. Done with this office and these people and this whole situation. Mrs. Ashford blocks our path, her body language desperate now instead of threatening. Wait, we can work this out privately. Name your price. I shake my head and tell her we'll be in touch through lawyers, my voice steady despite the adrenaline making my hands shake. Sophie and I walk back through the main store, past the mountains of white stuffing, and the unstuffed bearskin still hanging from displays, past the teenage employee who's now crying quietly by the register, past the security guard who's finally arrived but has no idea what to do. The other parents from the party are clustered near the entrance with their children, some holding partially stuffed bears, all looking shocked and confused. I push through the glass doors into the parking lot, and the afternoon sun feels too bright after the fluorescent lights inside. Sophie tugs on my hand and looks up at me with those eyes that see too much. Mommy, do the papers you took pictures of prove the bears were really slaves? I kneel down to her level, right there on the hot asphalt, and try to find words that are honest but not too heavy for a 7-year-old to carry. They prove something worse, baby. They prove that adults designed a whole system to make poor kids feel worthless. On purpose. For money. Sophie processes this silently, her face serious. Freya Stevenson is waiting by my car with Maya, both of them looking anxious and tired. Maya's bear is clutched in her arms, the one that had to bow to Penelope's bear, the one that wasn't allowed in the birthday photo. Freya's voice is quiet but firm when she speaks. Are we really going to face legal consequences for speaking the truth? Because I can't afford lawyers. I can barely afford groceries. I look at her and at Maya and at Sophie, and I feel something harden in my chest. We're not paying for anything. They are. That night, I sit at my kitchen table after putting Sophie to bed, spreading the photos across my laptop screen, zooming in on each damning document. The house is quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the street outside. I open the first spreadsheet and really study it this time, and the scope of Build-A-Bear's exploitation becomes clearer with each column of data. They specifically targeted stores in mixed-income areas, places where wealthy and poor families would interact, where social comparison would be most powerful. The spreadsheet tracks premium tier conversion through social comparison by location, with notes about which neighborhoods produce the highest upgrade rates. There are metrics I can barely believe are real. They tracked which children cried when denied add-ons. They recorded whether those tiers led to parents purchasing upgrades. They celebrated when parents went into debt or skipped other expenses to afford premium packages. One email chain discusses A/B testing different language to maximize parental guilt, comparing phrases like, your bear will be incomplete, versus, your bear won't have a soul, to see which generated more sales. The winner was implemented company-wide with a training video. Another document shows internal metrics celebrating a 340% increase in heartbeat sales after they started using the soulless bear language with standard tier customers. 340%. They turned children's emotional manipulation into a profit center, and then optimized it like any other business process. I find emails discussing how to structure party activities to maximize the visibility of tier differences, ensuring that standard package kids would feel excluded, and their parents would feel pressure to upgrade mid-party. There are cost-benefit analyses of making premium kids' experiences more visible, versus the risk of parents complaining about unfair treatment. The conclusion was that the revenue from upgrades outweighed the occasional complaint. My coffee goes cold as I read, and I don't bother reheating it. I pull up my email at 2 in the morning because I can't sleep. Can't stop thinking about Maya's grandmother having to choose between a bare heartbeat and lunch money. And I find the contact information my sister sent me months ago for a family attorney named Dexter Walls. I attach all the photos to an email and type out everything that happened. My fingers moving fast across the keyboard, the words pouring out in a rush. I hit send before I can second guess myself, and then sit there staring at my inbox, not really expecting a response at this hour. My phone buzzes 30 minutes later. Dexter's email is short and direct. This is potentially a massive consumer protection case. Are you prepared for what fighting Build-A-Bear corporate will mean? They have unlimited legal resources and will make your life difficult. I stare at the message for a long time, thinking about Sophie's face. When she explained why she started the bear revolution, thinking about Maya crying because her bear wasn't good enough for a photo, thinking about all those spreadsheets tracking children's tears for profit. I type back 4 words. I'm absolutely prepared. His response comes immediately. Good. Don't talk to anyone from Build-A-Bear or their lawyers. I'll call you first thing in the morning. I finally go to bed around 3, but I don't really sleep. Just lie there staring at the ceiling and running through everything in my head. Sophie's school calls at 8:30, before I've even finished my first cup of coffee. The principal's voice is carefully diplomatic. That tone adults use when they're trying to be fair, but are actually taking a side. We think it would be best if Sophie stayed home today. Several parents have called expressing concerns about having a dangerous child in the classroom, a child who breaks things and hurts other children. I grip the phone tighter and keep my voice level. Sophie doesn't have an anger problem. She has a justice problem. Maybe those parents should examine why their children participated in humiliating poor kids at a birthday party. Silence on the other end. Then the principal clears her throat. There's also been a suggestion that Sophie might benefit from anger management counseling. Just something to consider. Dexter arrives at my house that afternoon with a junior partner, a young woman with sharp eyes and a briefcase full of legal pads. They spread the evidence across my dining room table like prosecutors building a case, organizing the photos into categories, building timelines, making notes about which documents prove which violations. Dexter explains in clear, simple language that Build-A-Bear's tactics likely violate consumer protection laws in multiple ways. Unfair business practices, deceptive marketing, targeting minors with manipulative sales techniques. The junior partner adds that the systematic nature of the exploitation, the training materials, and corporate directives make this bigger than one store or one manager. This is company policy. Dexter leans back in his chair and looks at me directly. Mrs. Ashford is threatening you with $40,000 in damages. We can counter with a much larger lawsuit about systematic exploitation, but I need you to understand what you're getting into. Build-A-Bear will fight this hard. They'll try to make you look like a bad parent. They'll drag this out for months or years. They'll make settlement offers designed to shut you up. Are you still in? I think about those spreadsheets tracking children's tears. I'm in. Sophie sits at the other end of the table coloring in a princess book, her crayons scattered across the surface, but I can tell she's listening to every word. Dexter's partner notices too and addresses Sophie directly, speaking to her like a person instead of a child. Sophie, do you understand what was happening at the party? Can you explain it to me? Sophie puts down her crayon and looks up, her face serious. The Platinum kids got special badges that said VIP. The Standard kids didn't get badges. During the crown ceremony, they made the Standard kids sit in a different area, like we weren't good enough to stand with the rich kids. Maya cried when they said her bear couldn't be in the photo because it didn't have enough accessories. They made her hide her bear under the table. Dexter's partner records everything on her phone with Sophie's permission, asking careful questions, letting Sophie tell the story in her own words. Sophie describes the whole tiered system in perfect detail, remembering things I didn't even know happened. How the staff gave Platinum kids extra time at the stuffing station. How they announced each premium add-on loudly so everyone would know who could afford what. How they made the Standard kids' bears do a little bow when a Platinum kids' bear walked past during the fashion show. It was like they wanted us to feel poor, Sophie says, her voice matter-of-fact. They wanted the poor kids to know they were poor, and they wanted the rich kids to know they were rich. They made it into a game, but it wasn't fun. It was mean. Dexter nods and makes more notes. Your testimony as a child witness is powerful evidence. Courts take seriously when kids are harmed by business practices. Sophie goes back to coloring, satisfied that she's told the truth. My phone buzzes with an email notification, and I open it to find a formal demand letter from a law firm I've never heard of. Mrs. Ashford's lawyers, they're threatening to sue for the $40,000 in damages, plus emotional distress, plus Penelope's trauma from physical assault. The letter uses a lot of legal language designed to sound scary, talking about civil liability and personal responsibility, and the serious consequences of allowing a child to engage in destructive behavior. Dexter reads it over my shoulder and actually laughs. They're trying to intimidate you before we can organize a response. Classic corporate legal strategy. He pulls out his laptop and starts drafting a counter letter right there at my dining room table, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He writes about the evidence we discovered in Layla's office. He mentions the systematic exploitation of children and families. He suggests that Mrs. Ashford might want to reconsider litigation, given her husband's corporate position and potential personal liability for approving predatory business practices. He attaches a few of the most damning photos as a preview of what we have. Let them know we're serious, he says, hitting send. Sophie looks up from her coloring book and asks if we're going to win, and I tell her that sometimes winning just means making sure they can't hurt anyone else the same way. I set up the social media group that night after Sophie falls asleep, typing the title 3 times before settling on something that sounds innocent enough to avoid legal problems. Build-A-Bear birthday discussion. Generic. Safe. Within an hour, the first parent joins, then another, then 5 more appear all at once like they've been waiting for someone to create a space where they can finally talk about what happened. The posts start coming in fast, parents typing out stories they've apparently been holding inside since the party ended. One mom describes her son crying in the car on the way home, asking why his bear wasn't good enough to be in the birthday photo with the other bears. Another dad shares that his daughter asked if they were poor because her bear didn't get a heartbeat, and he didn't know how to explain that $15 shouldn't determine whether a stuffed animal has a soul. Freya posts around midnight, her message longer than the others, explaining that Maya hasn't touched her bear since the party, that it sits on a shelf in her room like a reminder of being treated as less than. She writes about watching her granddaughter learn that some kids matter more than others, based on what their parents can afford. And I read it twice because the anger in her words matches exactly what I'm feeling. By morning, 8 families have joined and the group chat shows 43 unread messages, each one another story of humiliation and hurt that Build-A-Bear designed into their party system on purpose. A private message pops up from someone named Minerva, and I click it open to find a mom I vaguely remember from the party, someone who stood in the back during the bear fashion show looking uncomfortable. She tells me her daughter asked if they were poor because her bear didn't get a heartbeat, that she's a single mom working 2 jobs and spent $200 on the party package thinking it would be enough to make her daughter feel included. The message gets harder to read as she describes realizing mid-party that the standard package was designed to make kids feel inadequate, that every premium add-on announcement was meant to highlight who could afford extras and who couldn't. She asks me about the evidence I found in the manager's office, typing the question 3 times like she's afraid to sound too aggressive. And when I tell her about the spreadsheets tracking emotional upsell opportunities and the training manual on leveraging child peer pressure, she responds immediately asking how we make Build-A-Bear pay for making children feel worthless based on their parents' income. I screenshot our conversation and send it to Dexter with a note saying, "This is what we're fighting for. Not just Sophie's bear revolution, but all the families who were exploited by a system designed to hurt them." My Instagram notifications go crazy Tuesday afternoon, and I open the app to find a message request from someone with a private account and no profile picture. The message says she's the teenage employee from the party, that her name is Jessica, and she needs to talk to me about what she's seen working at Build-A-Bear. I accept the request, and her profile loads showing a 17-year-old girl in a high school volleyball uniform, normal teenage stuff mixed with a few photos of her at work, wearing the standard Build-A-Bear employee vest. She sends 3 more messages in quick succession, typing fast like she's afraid she'll lose courage if she slows down, explaining that she's terrified of getting fired or facing retaliation, but watching Sophie's revolution made her realize she's been helping Build-A-Bear do something wrong. She describes the training she received on maximizing economic anxiety in parents, how managers taught her to announce premium add-ons loudly, so other kids would hear and pressure their parents, how she was supposed to use phrases like soulless bears and ugly bears to make standard package kids feel bad about their choices. The messages keep coming, each one more detailed than the last, and I realize she's been carrying guilt about this for months, maybe longer. I call Dexter immediately and read him the messages, and he asks if I can connect him with Jessica to take an official statement, explaining that whistleblower protections exist specifically for situations like this where employees witness illegal or unethical practices. I send Jessica his contact information with a message promising that speaking up is brave and necessary, that her testimony could help change a system that hurts kids and exploits families. The district manager from Build-A-Bear Corporate calls Thursday morning while I'm making Sophie breakfast, his voice professional but strained like he's already tired of dealing with this situation. He introduces himself as someone sent to investigate the incident at the birthday party, and I can tell from his tone that he's already decided I'm the problem before hearing my side of anything. He mentions that Layla provided a detailed report claiming I was aggressive and threatening, that I forced my way into her office and stole confidential company documents, that my daughter's destructive behavior was encouraged rather than stopped by negligent parenting. I listened to him list accusations for 3 minutes before interrupting to ask if he's prepared to discuss the evidence I photographed showing systematic exploitation of children and families through predatory pricing schemes. The silence on his end lasts long enough that I think the call dropped, but then he clears his throat and says he'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss the situation in person. I tell him I'll need to consult with my attorney before agreeing to any meetings, and I hear surprise in his voice when he responds, asking if I've retained legal counsel. Dexter told me to mention we're considering legal action regarding their business practices, so I say it exactly like he instructed, keeping my voice calm and polite while explaining that the documents I found raise serious concerns about Build-A-Bear's treatment of economically vulnerable families. The district manager ends the call quickly after that, promising to follow up through proper channels, and I know we've shifted from being seen as angry parents to being seen as an actual threat. Sophie goes back to the school Monday after 3 days at home, and I walk her all the way to her classroom door because I don't trust the other parents not to say something cruel while I'm not there to defend her. The hallway feels different from it did last week, parents pulling their kids closer when we pass, conversations stopping mid-sentence as we walk by, eyes following us like we're dangerous. Sophie's teacher intercepts us before we reach the classroom, her expression somewhere between concerned and uncomfortable, and she asks if we can talk privately for a moment. I tell Sophie to put her backpack in her cubby and wait inside, then follow the teacher down the hall to an empty room where she closes the door, and immediately starts explaining that Sophie has been telling classmates about economic exploitation of the working class, and she's concerned about age-appropriate content. I let her finish her whole speech about developmental stages and appropriate topics before asking if she's more concerned about Sophie understanding injustice or about wealthy parents being uncomfortable with those conversations. The teacher's face goes red and she stammers something about wanting all students to feel safe and included, but I can see in her eyes that she knows exactly what I'm asking. I tell her that Sophie witnessed real harm done to real children based on their family's economic status, and pretending that didn't happen won't protect anyone. It'll just teach kids that talking about unfairness is worse than the unfairness itself. The teacher nods slowly and says she'll make sure Sophie feels supported in class, but her voice wavers like she's not sure if she means it, or if she's just trying to end an uncomfortable conversation. Freya shows up at my house that afternoon with 3 other parents from the standard tier group, and I recognize 2 of them from the social media posts, but the third is someone I don't remember seeing at the party. We sit in my living room with coffee and store-bought cookies, and the stories start pouring out again, each one making me angrier than the last. A dad named Robert describes spending his grocery budget for the week on bear accessories because his daughter was crying about being excluded from the fashion show, how he had to explain to his wife why they were eating rice and beans for 5 days because he couldn't stand watching their kid be humiliated. A mom named Jerica borrowed $200 from her sister to upgrade their package mid-party after seeing her son's face when the Platinum kids got special badges and crown ceremony treatment, and she's still paying her sister back in $20 increments 3 months later. These aren't abstract problems or theoretical harm. These are real financial hardships caused by Build-A-Bear's designed exploitation. Families making actual sacrifices because a corporation decided to use children's emotions as leverage for profit. Freya sits next to me on the couch and puts her hand on my arm, while Jerica cries and I realize we're not just angry parents anymore. We're a community of people who've been hurt by the same system, and we're figuring out together how to fight back. Dexter calls during dinner with news that makes Sophie look up from her chicken nuggets, and I put him on speaker so she can hear too, because this affects her as much as it affects me. He's found 2 other attorneys interested in joining a potential class action lawsuit against Build-A-Bear for unfair business practices, lawyers who specialize in consumer protection, and think the evidence I documented could represent systematic violations across multiple Build-A-Bear locations, not just the one where Sophie started her revolution. He explains that class action means we'd be representing all the families affected by these practices, not just the ones from Penelope's party, and the case could potentially force Build-A-Bear to change their policies nationwide. His voice gets serious when he asks if I'm prepared for this to become much bigger than Sophie's birthday party incident, if I understand that going after a major corporation means months or years of legal fighting, media attention, and Build-A-Bear using every resource they have to make us look bad. Sophie is watching me across the table, chicken nugget halfway to her mouth, waiting to see what I'll say. I tell Dexter that's exactly what it needs to become, that Sophie freed the bears, but we need to free all the kids who've been exploited by this system, and I hear him typing notes on his end of the call, already planning our next steps. Mrs. Ashford appears at my front door Tuesday evening without warning, no lawyer beside her this time, looking like she hasn't slept in days. She asks if we can talk privately, her voice quiet and strained, and I hesitate before letting her inside because I don't know if this is a trap or a genuine attempt at conversation. We sit at my kitchen table and she immediately admits that her husband is furious about the evidence I have, that he's been on the phone with Build-A-Bear's legal team constantly, that he's pressuring her to make this go away quietly before it damages his career and the company's reputation. I ask if she's actually looked at what Build-A-Bear did to those children, if she's read the spreadsheets tracking which kids cried when denied add-ons, or the training materials about exploiting economic anxiety, and she starts crying before I finish the question. She tells me Penelope has been having nightmares about Sophie attacking her bear, waking up screaming about bears with their stuffing pulled out, and I realize she's trying to make me feel guilty for her daughter's trauma, without acknowledging that Build-A-Bear created the conditions that made Sophie's revolution necessary. I let her cry for a minute before responding, giving her space to feel whatever she's feeling, but I'm not going to apologize for Sophie exposing a system that hurt kids on purpose. I make tea because that's what you do when someone cries in your kitchen, even if that someone threatened to sue you last week. And we move to the front porch where Sophie is playing in the backyard, visible through the railing but far enough away that she can't hear our conversation. I explained to Mrs. Ashford that Sophie didn't attack Penelope. She attacked a system that taught Penelope her worth was tied to expensive bear accessories, that the real trauma isn't Sophie's revolution, but Build-A-Bear's exploitation of children's social dynamics for profit. Mrs. Ashford watches Sophie through the railing, my daughter digging in the dirt looking for interesting rocks, and admits the party tears made her uncomfortable. When she first read about them, but she wanted Penelope to have the best experience possible, never considering how it felt for other children to be treated as less than. She asks what I want from her, and I can hear genuine confusion in her voice like she actually doesn't understand why I'm fighting this hard. I tell her I want her husband to answer for approving these exploitative policies. I want Build-A-Bear to admit they designed a system to hurt vulnerable families, and I want every kid who was humiliated at those parties to know it wasn't their fault that they couldn't afford premium packages. Mrs. Ashford nods slowly and says she needs to think about everything, and I watch her walk to her car knowing that something shifted in this conversation, but not sure yet what it means. Mrs. Ashford's lawyer calls Dexter 2 hours after she leaves my porch, and Dexter Conference calls me immediately to share the news that they're withdrawing the lawsuit threat completely, and offering to cover my legal fees if we agree to keep the Ashford family out of any public action against Build-A-Bear. I can hear satisfaction in Dexter's voice when he explains this is a strategic retreat, that they're worried about Steve's liability as the board member who approved the tiered party program, that they'd rather pay my legal costs than risk him being named personally in a lawsuit. He advises me that accepting this offer means we can focus all our energy on the larger case against Build-A-Bear Corporate, without worrying about defending against their damage claims. I agree immediately to leave the Ashford family alone if they don't interfere with our case, and Dexter says he'll draft an agreement making that official. Sophie comes inside from the backyard with dirt under her fingernails and rocks in her pockets, asking what the phone call was about, and I tell her that sometimes people realize fighting you isn't worth it when they know you're right. I spend the next 2 days checking my social media posts obsessively, making sure everything I write about the party sounds neutral and factual rather than accusatory. I document the tiered pricing structure without naming names, share screenshots of Build-A-Bear's party packages with careful commentary about pricing transparency, post questions about whether other parents have experienced similar situations at birthday parties. 3 local parents comment saying they've noticed uncomfortable dynamics at retail birthday experiences, but weren't sure if they were overreacting. Then on Thursday morning, a woman named Nicole Manning sends me a direct message introducing herself as a consumer protection reporter for the local paper. She explains she's been following retail exploitation stories for 5 years, and my post caught her attention, because the pattern I'm describing matches tactics she's investigated at other children's entertainment venues. She asks if I'd be willing to talk on the record about what happened at the Build-A-Bear party, and my hands shake reading her message because this could either validate everything we've found, or make us look like crazy people attacking a beloved brand. I call Dexter immediately and read him Nicole's message, and he's quiet for a long moment before responding that media attention is risky, but might be our best leverage for forcing Build-A-Bear to take this seriously, rather than just trying to make us go away with legal threats. He warns me that once we go public, there's no taking it back, and I need to be prepared for Build-A-Bear's PR machine to paint me as a vindictive parent exploiting my daughter's behavior problems. I think about Maya's bear being forced to bow and serve, about Freya choosing between a heartbeat and groceries, about Sophie's face when she realized the poor kid's bears were being treated as lesser. I tell Dexter I'm ready to go on record. Nicole suggests meeting at a coffee shop downtown rather than my house, somewhere public and neutral where we can talk without feeling like either of us has home court advantage. I arrive 15 minutes early with a folder containing printed copies of everything I photographed in Layla's office, organized with sticky notes marking the most damaging sections. Nicole shows up exactly on time carrying a leather bag and a recorder, looking professional but approachable in jeans and a blazer. We order coffee and find a corner table away from other customers, and she starts by explaining her background investigating consumer protection issues and asking permission to record our conversation. I agree, and slide the folder across the table, watching her face as she opens it and starts reading the first page. Her expression changes from polite interest to focused attention to genuine shock as she works through the spreadsheets tracking revenue optimization and the emails about maximizing emotional upsell opportunities with economically vulnerable families. She stops at the training manual page about leveraging child peer pressure and looks up at me with something like anger in her eyes, asking if I'm certain these documents are authentic and from Build-A-Bear Corporate rather than just one manager's personal notes. I walk her through exactly how I found them in Layla's office, how the email chains show corporate executives approving the tiered party pilot program, how the spreadsheets track metrics across multiple store locations. Nicole asks permission to contact Build-A-Bear Corporate for official comment and to interview other families who attended parties at various locations, and I give her contact information for Freya, Minerva, and 3 other parents from our private social media group. She spends 2 hours with me going through every detail of Sophie's party, taking notes about the Bear Kingdom roleplay, and the servant bears, and the fashion show where standard tier kids had to sit on the floor. When we finally finish, she tells me she needs about a week to contact other families and get corporate's response. But based on what I've shown her, this looks like a systematic exploitation scheme that deserves serious investigation. I drive home feeling lighter than I have in days, like maybe someone with actual power to expose this is finally taking it seriously. Sophie notices I'm on my phone constantly over the next week, taking calls in the backyard and typing notes during dinner, and finally asks why I'm so busy with Bear Revolution stuff when she thought the party was over. I put my phone down and try to explain that sometimes when you see something wrong happening to people, you have to work really hard to fix it even after the immediate problem ends. She asks if all this work means she's in trouble for unstuffing the bears and breaking Penelope's arm, and I pull her onto my lap, telling her she's the complete opposite of in trouble. I explain that she's the one who showed me what Build-A-Bear was doing to hurt kids, that without her revolution I never would have looked in that office or found the proof that they were treating poor children badly on purpose. She asks how much longer the grown-up fighting will take, and I'm honest that I don't know, but it might be weeks or even months. We make a deal that she'll focus on just being 7 years old, playing with friends and doing homework and having fun, while I handle all the complicated adult parts of making Build-A-Bear change their rules. She agrees but makes me promise to tell her if anything important happens, because it's her revolution even if grown-ups are doing the paperwork parts. I promise. And she runs back outside to play, and I watch her through the window thinking about how she understands justice better at 7 than most adults ever will. The school counselor Anastasia Lim sends an email Tuesday morning requesting a meeting to discuss Sophie's recent behavior and concerning statements she's been making in class. I arrive at her office prepared to defend my daughter against accusations that she's violent or troubled, carrying copies of the Build-A-Bear evidence in case I need to explain why Sophie's actions were justified. Anastasia greets me warmly and offers tea, which immediately confuses me because I expected hostility or judgment. She explains that several teachers have mentioned Sophie talking about economic justice and revolutionary concepts during class discussions, and she's worried about whether Sophie is processing adult ideas without proper context or support. I start to get defensive, but Anastasia stops me, clarifying that she's not criticizing Sophie's values or saying she's wrong to care about fairness. She's concerned that Sophie might be carrying too much responsibility for fixing problems that adults created, that a 7-year-old shouldn't feel personally responsible for solving systematic injustice. We talk for an hour about how to help Sophie maintain her moral clarity, while also protecting her from feeling like the world's unfairness is her burden to fix. Anastasia suggests weekly check-ins where Sophie can talk about things she's noticed that feel unfair, and Anastasia can help her understand which problems she can address at her age and which ones require adult intervention. I agree immediately, grateful that someone at the school is supporting Sophie rather than punishing her. We schedule the first session for next week, and I leave feeling like maybe my daughter will get through this with her spirit intact and her mental health protected. Nicole's article publishes Friday morning with the headline, "Local Build-A-Bear Accused of Exploiting Children Through Tiered Party System," across the top of the local news section. My phone starts buzzing before I finish reading the first paragraph, messages flooding in from parents in our social media group, from people I haven't talked to in years, from complete strangers who saw the article online. Some messages are supportive, thanking me for exposing something that made them uncomfortable at their own kids' parties, but they didn't know how to articulate. Others are hostile, accusing me of being a vindictive parent using my daughter's behavior problems to attack a beloved brand and avoid taking responsibility for $40,000 in damages. I make the mistake of reading the online comments section and immediately regret it. People are calling Sophie a destructive brat who needs serious psychological help, calling me an enabler of violence who's teaching my daughter that tantrums are acceptable responses to disappointment. Someone suggests I'm just mad because I'm poor and couldn't afford the premium party package, which isn't even true but hurts anyway, because it misses the entire point about why this matters. Another commenter says Sophie should be in juvenile detention, and I should lose custody for raising a child who breaks other kids' arms. I close the comments and put my phone face down on the kitchen table, hands shaking with anger and hurt. Dexter calls an hour later saying he's seen the article and the response, warning me this is just the beginning of public scrutiny, and I need to develop thick skin fast because it's going to get worse before it gets better. Build-A-Bear Corporate issues an official statement by noon, which Nicole forwards to me with a note saying it's exactly the defensive response she expected. The statement calls our allegations mischaracterizations of premium service options designed to offer families choices in their celebration experiences, and emphasizes Build-A-Bear's unwavering commitment to creating magical experiences for all children regardless of economic background. They don't address any of the specific evidence I documented, don't mention the training materials about exploiting economic anxiety, don't acknowledge the emails about maximizing upsell opportunities with vulnerable families. The statement is pure corporate language designed to sound reassuring, while admitting nothing and promising nothing. Dexter calls after reading it and sounds almost pleased, explaining that this kind of defensive non-response suggests they're worried and trying to control the narrative before more families come forward with similar stories. He says companies that feel confident in their practices usually engage more directly with specific allegations, rather than issuing vague statements about their values. The fact that they're hiding behind corporate speak means our evidence is solid enough to scare them, which gives us leverage in potential litigation. I ask what happens next, and he explains we wait to see if other families contact us, document any additional evidence that surfaces, and prepare for Build-A-Bear's legal team to escalate their intimidation tactics now that we've gone public. 3 more families contact me over the weekend with stories that make my stomach turn. A mother from a store location 2 hours north shares photos of her daughter's servant bear that wasn't allowed in the group birthday photo because it didn't have premium accessories. Another parent describes a party where standard tier kids were told their bears had to work in the bear factory during the crown ceremony, while platinum kids' bears got to be royalty. A father sends me a video his wife recorded on her phone showing the teenage employees explaining to crying children that their bears would have basic hearts instead of premium hearts, unless parents paid extra. The pattern is undeniable and systematic across multiple locations and different managers, which means this isn't isolated incidents of individual employees being cruel, but actual corporate policy designed to humiliate children whose parents can't afford upgrades. I add all 3 families to our private social media group and share their evidence with Dexter, who confirms this strengthens our potential case significantly by showing the tiered party system with deliberately humiliating language is Build-A-Bear corporate policy rather than one store going rogue. Nicole contacts each family for follow-up interviews, and I can hear the anger in her voice when she calls me Tuesday evening saying she's found evidence of this system operating in 12 different Build-A-Bear locations across 3 states. Sophie comes home from the school Wednesday crying harder than I've seen since the party, and it takes me 10 minutes to calm her down enough to explain what happened. Apparently, several of her former friends' parents organized a meeting at someone's house last night that I wasn't invited to, and the kids overheard their parents discussing how to protect their children from Sophie's influence. The class mom sent a group email this morning uninviting Sophie from an upcoming birthday party, with the explanation that due to safety concerns following recent incidents, they need to limit the guest list to children without behavioral issues. Sophie shows me the email thread on the class parent portal where multiple mothers agree this is the responsible choice, and one suggests maybe Sophie should be in a different educational environment better suited to her needs. I read these messages from parents I've known for 3 years, parents whose kids played at our house and who I carpooled with, and who seemed perfectly nice until my daughter pointed out that treating poor kids badly is wrong. I watched my daughter's social life collapse in real time because she had the moral clarity to recognize injustice. and the courage to fight it. And I have to explain to her that sometimes doing the right thing means people get mad at you and treat you unfairly. She asks through tears if that means we should stop fighting Build-A-Bear, if maybe things would go back to normal if we just apologized and let it go. I tell her we're absolutely not stopping because what Build-A-Bear did was wrong and needs to be fixed. But I'm so sorry her friends are being mean because of grown-up problems that aren't her fault. I take Sophie for ice cream after school Thursday, just the two of us at the place with the good chocolate chip cookie dough, and we sit outside watching cars drive past while eating our cones. She's quiet for a while before asking if doing the right thing always makes people mad at you, and I try to explain that sometimes people get uncomfortable when you point out unfairness, because it makes them look at their own behavior and choices. I tell her that real friends support you even when things are hard, and friends who only like you when you're quiet about injustice aren't actually good friends. She thinks about this while licking melted ice cream off her hand, then says Maya is still her friend, and that's what really matters, because Maya understands why the bear revolution was important. I'm amazed by her moral clarity, by her ability to identify what's truly valuable at 7 years old. She asks if we're going to win against Build-A-Bear, and I'm honest that I don't know, but we're going to keep fighting because it's the right thing to do, regardless of whether we win. She nods seriously and says that's what heroes do in her books. They fight even when it's hard and even when people are mean to them. I hug her tight in the ice cream shop parking lot, this tiny person with more courage than most adults I know. Dexter calls Friday afternoon saying he and his team have finished preparing the formal complaint to file with the State Consumer Protection Agency. The complaint details Build-A-Bear's systematic exploitation of children's social dynamics for profit, includes all the evidence I documented plus statements from affected families, and requests official investigation into whether their practices violate consumer protection laws. They're also sending a pre-litigation demand letter directly to Build-A-Bear Corporate, outlining our evidence and requesting specific policy changes, plus compensation for all affected families. The letter gives them 30 days to respond before we proceed with filing a class action lawsuit. Dexter warns me that Build-A-Bear will likely try to drag this out or offer a settlement with strict non-disclosure agreements to make us go away quietly without admitting wrongdoing. He asks if I'm prepared for months or potentially years of legal process, for more hostile responses from the community, for Build-A-Bear's legal team to investigate every aspect of my life looking for ammunition to discredit me. I think about Maya's grandmother having to choose between a heartbeat and groceries, about Sophie being uninvited from birthday parties for pointing out cruelty, about all the kids who were made to feel worthless because their parents couldn't afford premium packages. I tell Dexter I'm absolutely prepared to see this through no matter how long it takes, or how ugly it gets. Mrs. Ashford calls 3 days later while I'm making dinner and her voice sounds different, smaller somehow. She asks if we can meet for coffee, says she needs to talk about something important. I agree cautiously, and we meet at the cafe near the library the next morning. She looks tired, dark circles under her eyes and her hands shake slightly as she stirs sugar into her coffee. She tells me Steve is being questioned by Build-A-Bear's board about his role in approving the tiered party program. They want to know why he signed off on training materials that specifically targeted vulnerable families. She admits their marriage is falling apart because she can't stop thinking about Maya's grandmother having to choose between a heartbeat and groceries. Penelope is in therapy now, processing what happened at the party, working through nightmares about bears getting torn apart, and understanding that she participated in something cruel, even though she didn't mean to. Mrs. Ashford asks if there's any way to make this right, if anything can undo the damage. I tell her the truth publicly would be a start. She nods slowly, says she's thinking about it, but she's scared of what it will cost her family. I remind her what it cost Maya's family, what it cost all the families who couldn't afford premium packages. She leaves without finishing her coffee. The thick envelope arrives 2 days later, delivered by courier, and I know what it is before I open it. Build-A-Bear's legal team, 3 lawyers listed across the top of the letterhead, demanding I cease making defamatory statements about their business practices immediately. They want all social media posts removed, all evidence returned, and they threaten legal action if I continue discussing the incident publicly. I scan the 6-page letter and send photos to Dexter, who calls back laughing within 10 minutes. He says this is standard intimidation, that corporations send these letters hoping people will panic and comply. We draft a response together, carefully detailing exactly which statements we can prove with documented evidence and which documents are already in the hands of consumer protection agencies. Dexter's letter is professional but firm, pointing out that truth is an absolute defense against defamation, and that we welcome the opportunity to present our evidence in court, if Build-A-Bear wishes to proceed. I sign it and mail it certified, but the whole process leaves me exhausted. I'm starting to understand why companies get away with exploitation. They have infinite resources to make fighting back absolutely miserable. They can pay lawyers to write threatening letters all day while I'm trying to work and raise my daughter and keep our lives functioning. The legal posturing drains energy I don't have to spare. Sophie comes home from the school crying Thursday afternoon, face red and streaked with tears. I pull her onto the couch and she tells me between sobs that a boy in her class said she's poor, and that's why she's mad about the bear party. He said his mom told him that poor people always blame rich people for their problems instead of working harder. My heart breaks watching my 7-year-old process class-based cruelty, understanding that adults are teaching their children these things. I explain as gently as I can that we're not poor, that we have enough money for what we need, but some families have less money than others, and that doesn't make them worth less as people. Sophie asks why the bear party treated them like it did then, why Maya's bear had to be a servant if money doesn't equal value. I don't have a good answer except that some people think money does equal value and we're fighting to show that's wrong. She asks if the boy's mom is right, if we're just jealous because we can't afford nice things. I tell her we could have afforded the platinum package if we wanted it, but that's not the point. The point is that Build-A-Bear designed a system to make children feel worthless, based on what their parents could pay, and that's wrong, no matter how much money anyone has. Sophie wipes her eyes and asks if fighting makes people hate you. I tell her sometimes yes, but that doesn't mean fighting isn't worth doing. Nicole calls Friday morning while I'm at work, speaking quickly and quietly like she's worried about being overheard. Build-A-Bear Corporate contacted her editor threatening legal action if the paper continues coverage of the story. They're claiming the reporting is biased and damaging to their business reputation. But Nicole's editor is standing behind the story, told corporate that everything published has been verified, and they welcome any legal challenge. Nicole has found internal whistleblowers willing to share more evidence of systematic exploitation across the franchise. Store managers from 3 different states have contacted her privately, sharing training materials and internal emails that show the tiered party program was rolled out company-wide with specific revenue targets attached. She wants to do a larger investigation, needs insider perspective on how the system actually works. I tell her about Jessica, the teenage employee who helped Sophie liberate the Christmas collection. Nicole asks if I can introduce them, if Jessica might be willing to talk about the training and pressure workers face to upsell vulnerable families. I text Jessica that afternoon, explain what Nicole is working on. Jessica responds within an hour saying she wants to help, that she's been carrying guilt about her role in this system for months. I connect them and hope Jessica doesn't face retaliation for speaking truth. Freya calls Saturday asking if I can come to a meeting at the public library Sunday afternoon. She's been contacting other families from the party and from other Build-A-Bear events, organizing people who've experienced similar treatment. 23 people show up Sunday, filling a small meeting room with parents and grandparents representing 15 different children. We share stories for over an hour, and the pattern is undeniable across every account. Children made to feel lesser because their bears didn't have premium features. Parents pressured to spend money they couldn't afford because their kids were crying about being excluded. The emotional manipulation was systematic, designed into the party structure itself. Several people are crying by the time we finish sharing. One father talks about his daughter asking if they're poor because her bear couldn't be in the photo. A mother describes borrowing money from her sister to upgrade mid-party because she couldn't stand watching her son's humiliation. We talk about what to do next, and several parents want to sue individually for what happened to their specific children. Dexter explains that a class action would be more powerful and efficient, that together we have evidence of systematic practices rather than isolated incidents. He warns that class actions take months or years, that Build-A-Bear will fight hard, that this will be exhausting and difficult. We vote to move forward together, understanding what we're committing to. The vote is unanimous. Build-A-Bear's 30-day deadline to respond to Dexter's pre-litigation demand passes with nothing but another letter from their lawyers, saying they're reviewing the allegations. No policy changes, no compensation offers, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just legal stalling tactics designed to exhaust us. Dexter files the class action lawsuit in state court the next morning, and suddenly everything becomes real and public and terrifying in a way it wasn't before. The lawsuit names Build-A-Bear Corporate, several executives including Steve Briggs, and requests damages for all affected families, plus injunctive relief requiring policy changes across all locations. Dexter explains that once it's filed, it becomes public record, that media will likely pick it up, that Build-A-Bear's response will probably be aggressive. I sign the paperwork with shaking hands, thinking about Maya's bear being forced to bow, about Sophie's revolution, about all the children who were taught their worth depends on what their parents can afford. The lawsuit is filed by noon, and my phone starts ringing with media requests by 2. The lawsuit makes regional news that evening, and by morning it's spread further. Reporters camp outside my house Tuesday morning, calling questions as I walk Sophie to the car for school. The school principal calls asking if we can use a side entrance to avoid media attention, suggesting it would be better for Sophie and the other students. My employer calls mid-morning asking if this legal situation will affect my job performance, if I need to take leave, if there's anything they should know. The questions are phrased carefully, but the concern is clear. They're worried about having an employee involved in high-profile litigation, worried about media attention, worried about controversy. I assure them I can handle my work responsibilities, that the lawsuit won't interfere. But I'm exhausted and scared and questioning if I'm doing the right thing putting my family through this scrutiny. Sophie's face when reporters shouted questions this morning keeps replaying in my mind. She looked small and frightened, nothing like the revolutionary who freed the bears. I wonder if protecting her means stopping this fight or seeing it through. Sophie asks Wednesday night if we can stop now, sitting on her bed in pajamas with tears running down her face. Kids at the school are being mean, calling her names, saying her mom is trying to steal money from Build-A-Bear. She doesn't want to be the bear revolution girl anymore. Doesn't want people staring and whispering and asking questions. I sit next to her and tell her we can absolutely stop if she wants, that protecting her is more important than any lawsuit. I tell her I'll call Dexter tomorrow and withdraw from the case if that's what she needs. She thinks for a long time, picking at a thread on her blanket, and I can see her processing something complicated. Finally, she says Maya's grandmother can't afford to stop, that Freya needs this lawsuit because she doesn't have money for lawyers on her own. She says if we stop, maybe other families will stop too, and then Build-A-Bear wins and keeps hurting kids. I'm crying as I hug her, this tiny person who understands solidarity better than most adults I know. She asks if doing the right thing always hurts this much, and I tell her sometimes yes, but that doesn't make it less right. Build-A-Bear's legal team sends a settlement offer Friday through Dexter. $50,000 split among all families, No admission of wrongdoing and mandatory agreements preventing us from discussing the case publicly. Dexter calls it an insultingly low offer designed to make us go away quietly. He does the math and explains that split among 15 families, it's barely enough to cover what people spent on the parties. Certainly not enough to compensate for the emotional harm to children or the financial stress families experienced. And the requirement prevents us from talking about what happened, from warning other families, from holding Build-A-Bear accountable publicly. The affected families meet at the library again Saturday to discuss the offer. Some people are tempted because they're exhausted and scared and the money would help even if it's not enough. Others are angry that Build-A-Bear thinks they can buy silence so cheaply. Minerva argues that accepting means teaching our children that corporations can exploit people and escape consequences by throwing small amounts of money at the problem. Freya says she didn't fight this hard to sign away her right to tell Maya's story. We vote and unanimously reject the settlement, agreeing to continue litigation even though it means more months of fighting, more stress, more uncertainty. Mrs. Ashford shows up at my house Sunday afternoon with Penelope, who looks nervous and small standing on my porch. Mrs. Ashford asks if Sophie will talk to Penelope about what happened at the party, says Penelope has questions her therapist thinks Sophie might be able to answer. I'm skeptical about putting Sophie through this, but ask her anyway, and Sophie agrees immediately. The two girls sit in my backyard on the grass while Mrs. Ashford and I watch from the porch, close enough to intervene if needed, but far enough to let them talk privately. Sophie explains to Penelope about Maya's bear being treated as a servant, about the fashion show where only platinum bears could walk, about hiding bears under the table for photos. Penelope starts crying, saying she didn't know it was mean. She thought it was just pretend like playing princess. Sophie tells her it wasn't pretend for Maya, that Maya's grandmother couldn't afford the heartbeat and Maya cried about it for days. Penelope asks why Sophie destroyed her birthday bear, and Sophie explains that the bear represented the whole system, that she had to show everyone what was really happening. Penelope's voice got quiet and she wiped her nose with the back of her hand. She told Sophie the dreams wake her up at night. All those bears with their insides pulled out and their eyes staring at nothing. Sophie scooted closer on the grass and put her hand on Penelope's arm. She said she was sorry for making her scared, but the bears had to be freed because they showed how Maya and the other kids were being treated. Like their feelings didn't matter just because their families had less money. Mrs. Ashford covered her mouth with both hands, and tears ran down her cheeks as she watched her daughter understand what she'd been part of without knowing it was wrong. Penelope asked if Maya was still sad about her bear, and Sophie said yes, that Maya's grandmother couldn't afford the heartbeat, and Maya felt like her bear wasn't as good as everyone else's bears. The girls looked at each other for a long moment, and then Penelope said she was sorry too, that she didn't know the party was hurting people. They hugged tight, and Sophie said maybe they could make all the bears equal from now on. No more servant bears or ugly bears or bears that weren't good enough for photos. Mrs. Ashford came down from the porch and knelt next to the girls, pulling them both into a hug while she cried. I watched from my chair and felt something shift inside me, a tiny piece of hope that maybe these two could grow up better than their parents, that maybe Sophie's revolution taught them something we'd all forgotten about fairness and kindness. 3 weeks later, Dexter called to say the discovery phase was starting, and Build-A-Bear had to hand over their internal documents about the party pricing and training materials. He warned me this would drag on for months because they'd fight every single request and try to hide anything that made them look bad. But the evidence I'd already photographed made it hard for them to claim the tiered system didn't exist, or that they didn't train staff to exploit families. He sounded tired on the phone, and I realized this case was eating up his time too, that fighting corporations meant endless paperwork and legal battles that wore everyone down. While we talked, my phone buzzed with 3 emails from families in other states who'd seen the news coverage and wanted to join our case. A mother from Ohio said her daughter's bear was called a peasant bear at a platinum party. A father from Texas said his son was told standard bears couldn't participate in the crown ceremony because they weren't royal enough. Another mother from Florida said the staff made her daughter's bear sit in the corner during group activities because she couldn't afford the premium accessories. Dexter asked if I could forward him the emails, and he'd reach out to these families about joining the class action. That more voices made our case stronger, and showed this wasn't just one bad store, but a company-wide problem. I sat at my kitchen table that night trying to help Sophie with her math homework, while Dexter's junior partner called about scheduling my deposition. Sophie kept asking me what 7 times 8 was, and I kept saying, "Hold on, sweetie," while the lawyer explained what questions Build-A-Bear's attorneys would ask me. My boss had already called twice that week, asking when I'd be back to full-time because I'd missed 3 days for legal meetings and my work was piling up. My bank account showed numbers that made my stomach hurt, because even with Dexter working partly for free, there were filing fees and expert witness costs, and 100 other expenses I hadn't planned for. I hung up with the lawyer and finally helped Sophie with her math, but my hands shook while I checked her answers. That weekend, Freya called and said she'd started a crowdfunding campaign to help all the families cover legal costs because she knew everyone was struggling. She'd written about Maya's servant bear and the choice between a heartbeat and groceries, and how we were fighting so other kids wouldn't face the same humiliation. Within 2 days, the campaign raised $3,000 from complete strangers who believed corporations shouldn't exploit children. By the end of the second week, we had $15,000 in messages from parents across the country saying they'd experienced similar things at birthday parties and retail stores, that our fight mattered to people we'd never meet. Build-A-Bear's PR team launched a big campaign about their commitment to inclusive experiences and magical moments for every child. They put out press releases and social media posts showing diverse kids playing with bears and smiling families at parties. Then they announced a new unified party package with no tiers, just one experience for everyone with all the add-ons included in the base price. The press release never said the old system was wrong or apologized to the families they'd hurt, just acted like they were being generous by making this change. They claimed our lawsuit had no merit, and they were updating their offerings because they always listened to customer feedback. Dexter laughed when he read it and said this was actually perfect for our case because it proved they knew the tiered system was a problem, even while they denied doing anything wrong. If the old system was fine, why change it so dramatically? Their own actions admitted guilt even as their lawyers claimed innocence. Sophie's teacher sent home a note about a class project on standing up for what you believe in. Each kid had to create a presentation about someone who fought for justice, or about their own experience with doing the right thing. Sophie decided to present about the bear revolution and economic justice, and she spent a week building a poster board with photos of stuffed animals arranged in tiers. She made platinum bears with crowns and accessories standing on a platform, while standard bears sat below them on the floor. She wrote about Maya's grandmother choosing between a heartbeat and lunch money, and about servant bears carrying the rich bear's things. Half the parents called the school the day before presentations, saying this content was inappropriate for second graders, that Sophie was pushing political ideas on innocent children. The teacher called me, and I expected her to ask Sophie to change topics, but instead she said she was defending Sophie's right to share her real experience, and that maybe those parents were uncomfortable because their kids participated in the same kind of exclusion. I took the morning off work to attend the presentations and sat in a tiny chair in the back of the classroom. Sophie stood at the front with her poster board and explained to 27 second graders how Build-A-Bear's system was designed to make poor kids feel worthless, so their parents would spend money they couldn't afford. She used her stuffed animals to act out the fashion show, and the photo where some bears had to hide under the table. She talked about systematic exploitation in words I'd taught her, but with examples from her own life that made the other kids lean forward and listen. When she finished, 3 kids raised their hands to share their own stories about birthday parties where they felt left out because their families couldn't afford the expensive packages. My deposition happened on a cold morning in a conference room downtown. Build-A-Bear's legal team had 3 lawyers sitting across from me with stacks of documents and recording equipment. Dexter sat next to me and squeezed my hand under the table before they started. They asked about my parenting style and whether I'd ever had trouble controlling Sophie before. They asked if I'd coached her to destroy the party as revenge for some perceived slight. They asked why I didn't stop her the moment I arrived instead of letting the destruction continue. They showed me photos of the unstuffed bears and the damaged store, and asked if I felt any responsibility for the $40,000 in damages. Dexter had prepared me for all of it, and I kept my voice calm and steady. I explained that Sophie didn't destroy a party. She responded appropriately to witnessing injustice against her friend and other children. I said the real destruction was a system designed to humiliate kids based on their parents' income, and that Sophie's actions exposed that system for what it was. I described finding the documents in the manager's office and photographing evidence of deliberate exploitation. The lawyers got frustrated when I didn't break down or get defensive, when I kept redirecting their questions back to Build-A-Bear's practices instead of Sophie's behavior. After 4 hours, they dismissed me, and Dexter said I'd done great, that I'd stayed focused on the real issue instead of letting them make me feel like a bad parent. 2 weeks later, Dexter called with news about Steve Briggs's deposition. He said it had gone terribly for Build-A-Bear's side because Steve got defensive and evasive every time they read his emails back to him. When they showed him the message about maximizing emotional upsell opportunities with economically vulnerable families, he claimed he didn't remember writing it. When they asked about the premium tier conversion bonuses, he said those were standard business metrics. When they pushed him on whether he understood the tiered system would humiliate lower-income children, he got angry and said parents should teach their kids not to compare themselves to others. Dexter said several board members were already distancing themselves from Steve, claiming he'd implemented the program without full board approval or oversight. The corporate unity was falling apart as everyone tried to avoid personal liability, and that meant our case was getting stronger because they couldn't present a unified defense. The affected families gathered at the library again to discuss Build-A-Bear's second settlement offer. $200,000 total split among all of us. Policy changes already implemented, but still requiring us to sign agreements saying we'd never discuss the case publicly. The mood in the room was heavier than before because we were all exhausted and scared, and some families desperately needed that money. One mother said her hours had been cut at work, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep fighting. Another father said his son was still in therapy processing the party trauma, and the medical bills were piling up. Minerva stood up and argued that accepting the settlement meant teaching our children that corporations can hurt people and escape real consequences by throwing money at the problem. She said we needed admission of wrongdoing, not just quiet policy changes and cash. Freya said she didn't fight this hard to sign away Maya's right to tell her story. That silence was what corporations counted on to keep exploiting families. We talked for 2 hours, and voices got loud and some people cried. Finally, we voted, and the decision was close, but we agreed to reject the settlement and keep fighting. Everyone acknowledged this was getting harder, and we couldn't blame anyone who needed to drop out. But for now, we'd stay united. The hate mail started arriving at my house 3 days later. Letters calling me a greedy opportunist using my daughter's behavior problems to extort money from an innocent corporation. Emails saying I was teaching Sophie to be a victim and destroy things when she didn't get her way. One letter said I should be investigated for child abuse because I was putting Sophie through legal stress for my own financial gain. I deleted most of them without reading past the first few lines, but Wednesday morning someone spray-painted fraud across my driveway in huge red letters. Sophie saw it through the kitchen window before I could stop her and asked what the word meant. I sat her down at the table and explained that some people thought we were lying about what Build-A-Bear did, that they believed we made it up to get money. Sophie's face got very serious and she asked if we were lying. I took her hands in mine and told her we were telling the exact truth about everything that happened, that we had documents and witnesses and photos proving it all. I said some people get angry when you tell the truth because the truth makes them uncomfortable about things they'd rather ignore. She asked why telling the truth made people spray paint our driveway, and I didn't have a good answer except that fighting powerful corporations means some people will try to make you stop. Nicole called that Friday saying her follow-up investigation was ready to publish. She'd gotten internal Build-A-Bear documents showing the tiered party system generated $8.3 million in additional revenue last year across their whole franchise. Corporate emails proved executives received bonuses tied to premium tier conversion rates, meaning they got paid more money when they successfully pressured families to upgrade packages. The documents showed they specifically targeted stores in mixed-income areas, because social comparison between rich and poor kids drove the most upgrades. Nicole's story went national that weekend, picked up by major news outlets and shared thousands of times on social media. Suddenly, we weren't just local troublemakers fighting one store, we were part of a bigger conversation about corporate exploitation of children and families. Parent advocacy groups started calling asking us to speak at conferences. Consumer protection organizations cited our case in their campaigns against predatory pricing. The story got bigger than any of us had imagined, and I felt the weight of it pressing down on my shoulders, knowing we couldn't stop now even if we wanted to because too many people were watching and counting on us to keep fighting. The phone wouldn't stop ringing that week. Parent advocacy groups left messages saying they wanted to feature our story in their campaigns about corporate accountability. A consumer protection organization invited me to speak at their annual conference about fighting unfair business practices. 3 different podcasts reached out asking if I'd share our experience fighting Build-A-Bear's exploitative policies. I listened to each voicemail twice before deleting them, because I didn't know how to explain that I wasn't trying to be an activist. I was just a mom who found evidence of something wrong and refused to pretend I hadn't seen it. Dexter called Wednesday afternoon while I was making dinner, and Sophie was doing homework at the kitchen table. He said one of the consumer protection podcasts was particularly respected, and reaching out to me specifically because our case represented something bigger than just birthday party pricing. I stirred pasta and told him I appreciated the opportunity, but I wasn't comfortable being the face of a movement when I was still figuring out how to help Sophie process everything that happened. Dexter was quiet for a moment before saying that sometimes regular people become activists simply by refusing to accept injustice, that I didn't need to have all the answers or be perfect to share what we'd learned. I told him I'd think about it and hung up feeling the weight of all those families counting on me to keep fighting when I was exhausted and scared, and just wanted my daughter's life to go back to normal. The business organizations defending Build-A-Bear were louder and meaner than the parent groups supporting us. The National Retail Federation issued a statement saying premium service tiers were standard business practice, and parents who couldn't afford upgraded packages shouldn't expect equal treatment. A conservative think tank published an article calling our lawsuit an attack on free market principles, and saying we were teaching children they deserved things they hadn't earned. The comments under Nicole's follow-up article were brutal, with people saying poor families should stay home if they couldn't afford premium experiences, and that we were raising a generation of entitled kids who expected participation trophies. I read those comments late at night when I couldn't sleep, and felt sick thinking about Maya and the other children being used as examples in political arguments about capitalism and fairness. Sophie asked me Thursday morning why some people thought it was okay that her friends' bears were treated badly, and I tried to explain that some adults believe money should determine how people are valued. She looked at me with those serious 7-year-old eyes and asked if we believe that, and I told her absolutely not. That's why we were fighting even though it was hard. Build-A-Bear's legal team sent Dexter a formal request for mediation 2 weeks after Nicole's investigation went national. Dexter explained over coffee at my kitchen table that mediation meant they wanted to settle the case without admitting fault, but were willing to negotiate seriously because the public pressure was hurting their brand. He said we'd sit in a room with a professional mediator who would help both sides reach an agreement, that it would be exhausting and frustrating, but it was progress. I asked what happened if we couldn't reach an agreement, and he said we'd continue with the lawsuit, which could take years and cost more money than any of us had. The affected families met at the library that weekend to discuss whether we should participate in mediation, and everyone was tired enough that we voted yes within an hour. Minerva said she'd lost 2 days of work already for depositions, and couldn't afford to lose more fighting a case that might never end. Freya held Maya close and said she just wanted her granddaughter to move forward without this hanging over them forever. The mediation took place in a conference room downtown with windows overlooking the city, and furniture that probably cost more than my car. I sat on one side of a long table with Dexter and representatives from 5 other affected families while Build-A-Bear's corporate lawyers filled the other side in expensive suits that made our regular clothes look shabby. The mediator was a woman in her 50s who explained the ground rules in a calm voice that made me want to scream, because nothing about this situation was calm. We were arguing about whether corporations should be allowed to make children feel worthless based on their parents' income, and she was treating it like a standard business dispute. Steve Briggs sat 3 seats down from me, looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact, while his lawyers shuffled papers and whispered strategies. The first 2 hours were mostly lawyers talking in circles about liability and damages and policy implications, while I sat there thinking about Maya's bear having to bow to Penelope's bear and feeling my anger build with every corporate deflection. The mediator asked me directly what we wanted from Build-A-Bear, and I looked across that table at Steve and his lawyers and said we wanted them to admit they designed a system to exploit children's emotions for profit. Steve's lead lawyer immediately objected, saying that was inflammatory language, but the mediator held up her hand and asked Steve if he wanted to respond. He cleared his throat twice before speaking, and his voice was quieter than I expected when he admitted the tiered party program was designed to use social comparison among children to drive revenue. He said they knew some families would feel uncomfortable, but the profit margins justified the approach, and corporate approved the rollout based on successful pilot programs. His lawyers looked furious that he'd said anything, but the mediator wrote down his words, and I felt something shift in the room. Someone with actual power had acknowledged the harm, even if it was in a confidential mediation session that wouldn't become public record. The mediator turned to me and asked what it would take for us to settle, and I said we needed real policy changes across all Build-A-Bear locations, compensation that reflected the damage done to these families, and public acknowledgement that their previous practices caused harm to children. Steve's lawyers immediately started arguing that public statements would open them to additional liability, but Dexter cut them off and said we weren't interested in settling if Build-A-Bear planned to quietly change policies, while denying they'd done anything wrong. We broke for lunch, and I stood in the hallway with the other parents eating sandwiches from the building cafeteria, while Build-A-Bear's legal team went to some expensive restaurant nearby. Minerva said watching Steve admit the exploitation was designed intentionally made her want to flip the conference table, but at least we'd gotten him on record. Freya said she didn't care about the money as much as making sure Maya knew that what happened to her mattered enough that adults fought to change it. We went back into that conference room for 4 more hours of negotiations about dollar amounts and policy language and public statement wording until my head hurt, and I'd missed 2 days of work that I couldn't afford to lose. The mediator finally called it at 6 in the evening, saying we'd made significant progress and would reconvene the following week to finalize terms. I drove home exhausted and found Sophie eating dinner with my neighbor who'd picked her up from the school, and I felt guilty that fighting this corporation meant other people had to take care of my daughter. The second mediation session happened 5 days later, and this time we came prepared with specific demands written out by Dexter and reviewed by all the affected families. We wanted $500,000 split among the families based on documented harm, permanent elimination of tiered party systems across all Build-A-Bear locations, mandatory staff training on treating all customers with equal dignity, regardless of package price, and a public statement acknowledging their previous practices caused harm to children and families. Build-A-Bear's lawyers countered with $300,000 and vague policy review language that didn't commit to anything concrete. We spent 6 hours arguing over every word in the settlement agreement, while the mediator tried to find middle ground between corporate liability concerns and our demand for real accountability. Steve sat there looking more uncomfortable as the day went on, and twice his lawyers had to pull him out of the room for private conversations. By 4 in the afternoon, we'd reached a tentative agreement that included the full $500,000, specific policy elimination language, the staff training requirement, and a public statement that was more corporate speak than genuine apology, but at least acknowledged their practices caused harm. The one thing we'd fought hardest for and won was dropping the NDA requirement, which meant we could discuss the case and outcome publicly, instead of being silenced by settlement terms. Dexter called it a significant victory, even though it wasn't everything we wanted, and I sat in my car in the parking garage after signing the preliminary agreement and cried from exhaustion and relief and disappointment that we couldn't get full admission of wrongdoing. I called Freya from the car, and she said Maya asked her that morning if the fighting was almost over because she missed when her grandma wasn't always tired and stressed. I told her we'd reached a settlement, and she started crying too, saying she could finally stop worrying about legal bills, and Maya could move forward. The affected families gathered at the library one final time to vote on accepting the settlement, and the room felt different from our previous meetings. People looked relieved but also sad that we couldn't push harder for complete accountability. Minerva stood up and said she was voting yes because her family needed the money, and the policy changes were real even if the apology was weak. Another father said his son was still in therapy processing the party trauma, and he just wanted this chapter closed so they could heal. We talked for an hour about what accepting the settlement meant, and whether we were teaching our children that corporations could hurt people and buy their way out of consequences. Freya finally stood up holding Maya's hand and said her granddaughter could move forward knowing her experience mattered enough that adults fought to create change, that sometimes partial victories were still victories worth celebrating. We voted and everyone raised their hands to accept the settlement. Sophie had come to the meeting because I couldn't find a babysitter, and when the vote passed, all the families started clapping, and several people came over to hug her saying she'd started this whole fight by refusing to accept injustice. Build-A-Bear finalized the settlement 2 weeks later, and their corporate communications team released a public statement that I read 3 times, trying to find genuine remorse in the carefully worded corporate language. The statement said they recognized their previous party tier system did not reflect their values of inclusion and creating magical experiences for all children, that they had implemented comprehensive policy changes including elimination of tiered pricing structures and mandatory staff training on economic sensitivity, and they apologized to families who felt their children were treated unfairly. It was the kind of statement written by lawyers to acknowledge problems without accepting legal liability, but it was public acknowledgement that we'd been right about the exploitation. Nicole wrote a follow-up article about the settlement and quoted the statement alongside testimonials from affected families about how the tiered system had hurt their children. The article got shared thousands of times, and parent groups started using our case as an example in their campaigns about corporate accountability. The settlement checks arrived in the mail 6 weeks after we signed the final agreement, and each family's amount varied based on documented harm and legal fee contributions. Freya called me crying the day her check came, saying it was enough to start a real college fund for Maya and turn something painful into something hopeful for her granddaughter's future. I deposited our portion and immediately transferred money to cover Dexter's remaining legal fees that he'd reduced significantly, but still represented hours of work he'd done mostly pro bono. I sent another chunk to the family expense fund we'd created to help families who'd struggled financially during the lawsuit. The rest went into savings because I'd learned that fighting corporations meant you needed a cushion for the next time you had to miss work or pay unexpected costs. Sophie asked what we were going to do with the money, and I told her most of it was going to help the lawyer and other families, that the point was never getting rich but making Build-A-Bear change their policies, so other kids wouldn't be treated the way Maya was treated. Sophie's social life started improving slowly as the lawsuit ended, and media attention faded from our daily lives. Some of the parents who'd shunned us after the bear revolution reached out with awkward apologies saying they'd overreacted, and their children missed playing with Sophie. A few families whose kids had been at the party invited Sophie over for playdates, and told me they were sorry for believing Build-A-Bear's version of events instead of listening to what actually happened. Sophie made new friends at the school who thought the bear revolution was brave instead of scary, and who asked her questions about standing up for what's right even when adults get mad. She and Maya stayed close through everything, and I'd watch them play with their bears in my backyard, making up elaborate stories where all the bears were equal, and went on adventures together, saving other toys from unfair treatment. The bears they'd built at that terrible party had become symbols of something bigger than stuffed animals, and sometimes I'd hear Sophie explaining to Maya's bear that it was just as valuable as any fancy bear with expensive accessories. The school year ended in May, and Sophie's teacher asked to meet with me on the last day of classes. I walked into her classroom expecting another conversation about Sophie's revolutionary tendencies disrupting lesson plans. But instead, the teacher told me she'd never had a student quite like Sophie, who taught her entire class about standing up for what's right even when it's hard and scary. She said Sophie had helped several students find their voices when they saw classmates being treated unfairly, and that her presence had made the classroom a more just place. The end-of-year assembly happened that Friday afternoon, and I sat in the auditorium with other parents watching kids receive awards for academic achievement and perfect attendance. When the principal announced the citizenship award and called Sophie's name, I started crying watching my daughter walk across that stage while parents who'd once called her dangerous and destructive applauded her courage. Penelope was sitting 3 rows ahead of us with Mrs. Ashford, and when Sophie were accepted her certificate, Penelope turned around and gave her an enthusiastic thumbs up that made both girls smile. Mrs. Ashford contacted me through email 2 days after school ended, saying she needed to talk and asking if we could meet for coffee. I almost deleted the message, but something about the tone made me agree to meet her at a cafe near my house the following morning. She looked different from I remembered from the bear party, tired and older somehow, and she ordered tea with shaking hands before telling me she and Steve were getting divorced. She said the lawsuit wasn't the only reason, but it had forced her to examine their values and what they were teaching Penelope about money and worth, and she didn't like what she saw. She talked for 20 minutes about marriage counseling and separate bedrooms, and finally accepting that Steve prioritized profit over people in ways she couldn't ignore anymore. I listened without saying much because I didn't know what response she wanted from me. She finally stopped talking and looked at me directly and said thank you for not destroying Steve publicly, even though I had leverage with information about his private life. She said Penelope talked about Sophie constantly as the friend who taught her that fairness mattered more than expensive things, and that she hoped both girls would grow up understanding their choices created the kind of world they'd live in. I told her I hoped she and Penelope found peace, and that Penelope would learn her privilege came with responsibility to make things better for people with less. We finished our drinks and hugged in the parking lot, and I drove home thinking about how the bear revolution had changed so many lives in ways none of us expected that day when Sophie unstuffed her first bear and declared them all prisoners needing liberation. Summer arrived and Build-A-Bear rolled out their new party system across every location in the country. Nicole published a follow-up article in the paper featuring interviews with families who tried the reformed parties, and the responses were completely different from what we'd seen before. Parents talked about feeling respected instead of pressured, about their kids having fun without noticing any difference based on what they paid. One mom wrote that her daughter came home happy with her bear and never once mentioned feeling left out or less than. Another family said the staff treated everyone the same and made sure all the kids felt special during the heart ceremony. The changes were real and measurable, not just corporate talk designed to make the lawsuit go away. Jessica got promoted to shift supervisor at her store and helped train other employees on the new rules about treating families fairly regardless of their budget. She sent me a message saying she felt proud to work there now instead of guilty, that she could look kids in the eye without feeling like she was part of something wrong. 6 months after the settlement, I took Sophie back to Build-A-Bear for the first time since the revolution. My hands were shaking in the parking lot because I didn't know how she'd react walking back into that space where everything had exploded. Sophie grabbed my hand and squeezed it and told me she wanted to build a bear the right way this time. We walked in together and the store looked the same but felt completely different without the tiered party setup and the premium badges and the separate areas for different kinds of kids. The staff recognized us immediately, and I tensed up waiting for anger or judgment, but instead they smiled and welcomed us like we were regular customers who hadn't caused $40,000 in damages and a national scandal. Sophie picked out a brown bear with soft fur, and we went through the stuffing process together, while she explained to me exactly how much stuffing made a bear feel right. When we got to the heart ceremony, Sophie chose a heartbeat without any employee telling her it cost extra, or that her bear would be soulless without it. She named her bear Justice and held it close while the employee sealed the back seam. The manager came over, a different woman than before because apparently the company quietly transferred people around after the lawsuit, and she thanked us for helping make Build-A-Bear better. Sophie looked up at her and said the bears were never the problem, just the system that tried to make some bears worth more than others. The manager nodded and said she understood that now. 3 weeks later, I got an email from a parent advocacy organization asking if I'd speak at their annual conference about consumer protection and standing up to corporate practices that hurt families. The conference was in 2 months, and they wanted me to talk about our experience fighting Build-A-Bear and what we learned about recognizing exploitation. I stared at that email for an hour because I'm terrified of public speaking, and the thought of standing in front of hundreds of people made my stomach hurt. But I kept thinking about all the families who reached out during the lawsuit saying they'd experienced similar things at other companies and didn't know they could fight back. I wrote back and said yes, I'd speak, because maybe our story could help other parents see when their kids were being treated unfairly and give them courage to push back. Sophie asked if she could come with me, and I almost said no, because I wanted to protect her from more attention, but she insisted that the revolution was hers too, and she wanted to be there. The day of the conference arrived, and we drove 2 hours to the convention center where the event was being held. Sophie wore her favorite dress and carried Justice the Bear in her backpack. We sat in a room backstage while other speakers presented, and I practiced my talk over and over in my head, trying not to throw up from nerves. When they called my name, I walked out onto that stage with 300 parents in the audience, and my voice shook as I started talking about the birthday party and what Sophie had seen. But then I looked at Sophie sitting in the front row holding Justice, and I remembered why this mattered. I talked about the tiered system and the documents we found, and how Sophie's revolution forced us all to look at practices we'd been accepting without question. I talked about the lawsuit and the families who came together and the changes Build-A-Bear made. When I finished speaking, the entire audience stood up and applauded. But they weren't applauding me. They were looking at Sophie and clapping for the 7-year-old who saw injustice and refused to accept it. Life settled into something that felt almost normal after that. Sophie went back to the school in the fall, and instead of being known as the destructive kid who ruined a party, other parents started calling her the amazing kid who fought Build-A-Bear. She made new friends whose parents actually liked that she stood up for what was right instead of staying quiet. She still had that fierce sense of fairness that made her speak up when she saw people being treated badly, but now she had words for those feelings instead of just anger. I watched her one day at recess when a group of kids were making fun of a boy for wearing shoes that were falling apart. Sophie walked right over and told them his shoes didn't matter, and that being mean about money stuff made them bullies. The kids stopped and walked away, and the boy with the worn shoes looked at Sophie like she'd just saved his life. She came home that afternoon and told me about it, and I realized the Bear Revolution had taught her that her voice could change things, that speaking up mattered even when it was hard. Freya became one of my closest friends through everything that happened. Our families started celebrating holidays together along with some of the other families from the lawsuit, and we built this community based on actually caring about each other instead of competing over who had more money. The kids played together in my backyard or at the park, and they never seemed to notice or care about economic differences, because we taught them that worth wasn't measured in dollars or fancy toys. Maya and Sophie talked constantly about being roommates in college someday, and starting some kind of organization that fought unfair treatment of kids. I'd listened to them planning their future and actually believed they could change the world together, because they'd already proven they could take on a corporation and win. A year after the settlement, Build-A-Bear contacted us with an unexpected request. They wanted our family to participate in a promotional campaign about their new inclusive practices, and they were offering to pay us and feature Sophie as a young advocate for fairness. The marketing person explained they wanted to show how listening to customers, even young ones, made them a better company. I told Sophie about the offer and said she could decide because this was her story as much as mine. She thought about it for 2 days and then said she'd do it, but only if Maya and the other kids from the lawsuit could be included too. She said the revolution was never about her alone. It was about all the kids who got treated badly, and all the families who fought together. I called the marketing person back and explained Sophie's condition and waited for them to say no. Instead, they agreed immediately and expanded the campaign to celebrate all the children who helped them become better. The photo shoot happened at a Build-A-Bear store they closed for the day so we could have privacy. Sophie, Maya, and 5 other kids from the lawsuit spent the afternoon building bears together while photographers captured everything. The kids were genuinely happy and excited, making their bears and helping each other pick out accessories without any mention of tiers or premium packages. Build-A-Bear created posters and social media content with photos of the kids, and text about listening to their youngest customers and learning from their wisdom. It felt weird knowing a corporation was using our activism to make themselves look good, but the kids were proud, and the message reached millions of families. Sophie told me afterward that she was glad the bears were free now, that the whole system had changed because people fought back. I told her I was glad she taught me to see injustice I'd been missing my whole life. Sophie started 3rd grade that fall as a completely different kid than the one who'd caused the Bear Revolution 2 years before. She walked into school confident and sure of herself, knowing her voice mattered and that standing up for what's right is worth whatever cost comes with it. She still talked about fairness and economic justice when she saw problems, but she also got to just be 8 years old now. She joined a soccer team and made friendship bracelets and read books about kids saving the world. I stood in the school parking lot on that first day watching her walk through the doors with her backpack and her lunchbox and Justice the Bear hanging from a clip. I thought about everything that happened since that birthday party, about how she changed Build-A-Bear and our community and me. The Bear Revolution was over, but the girl who started it was just beginning to understand her power to make the world more fair, and I couldn't wait to see what she'd fight for next.